Okay, so in the previous instalment we covered Augustine's life and his negative doctrines in terms of combating heresy and a little bit of his own positive views in terms of his views on evil. Now, in this episode I'm going to deal with 6 of his positive doctrines, which will go on to have a lasting effect on the views of men in the West for the next millennium. So, where was he coming from with these? Well, much of his sort of philosophy was based on Neoplatonism. It's been argued that Catholic Christianity is just a form of Judaized Neoplatonism. So let's move on to kind of these 6 key ideas that are coming out, the sort of merging of Platonism and Christianity. Well, I think the first is something that's derived purely from Christianity. This is this idea of a new truth validity criterion, or as I term it. This is like basically a new way of deciding whether things are valid. So previously we talked about Plato's deductive method. That's, reasoning from abstractions to individual instances, and then Aristotle's inductive method of reasoning from, instances to abstractions. Well, in this case there was sort of the idea of another form of validity, and that's whatever was in the scriptures was valid. So, this is something that if you accept it as valid, then, it works as a source of validity, but otherwise it doesn't. This would go on to dominate Western thought, this idea of reconciling things to the scriptures for the millennium to come. The second is this idea of sort of a body-soul dichotomy. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a split between 2 things. You've got the body and the soul. Most people probably have a fairly good understanding of roughly what it means when people talk about soul, at least in terms of the Judeo-Christian concept, but the Greek concept was a bit different. So you had one of the early Greeks, this chap called Thales, who had this idea that soul was sort of an animating principle. So he said magnets have a soul. Now obviously it's not really the case that magnets have some kind of ethical idea that we'd associate with the soul, but basically this idea that they had something to animate them. Later on in ancient Greek thought, the soul did take on an ethical character, and this continued into Plato's time. Now, with Augustine, you kind of have this interest in the soul primarily as this idea of something of being immortal, much like Plato conceived of the soul. It would survive after death. And you have sort of 4 different views of the soul, well, 3 different views of the soul that were knocking around at the time. The first is that the soul exists prior to the body, and that was the view of Origen, and he was one of the early church fathers. Now, Augustine rejected this view because it meant that you could have sins pre-birth, and therefore, there was no guarantee that salvation would be available for these sins, so therefore he rejected it. The second view was the view that the soul was created by parents. This was the view of another church father called Tertullian, and this was quite useful for Tertullian because it meant that sin passed from the parents to the kids, which got out of some theological difficulties. And the third view was that, put forward by St. Jerome, that was that all souls were created by God, or the creationist view. Now you might think this is a pretty sort of abstract argument and point to make, but in fact this view that all souls are created by God affected the Catholic Church's views on abortion, and it's been very influential to this day because of that. Now this idea of the soul as being immortal is not necessarily present in all of the early philosophers. Aristotle has quite a mechanistic view of the soul, so it's just a sort of animating principle. So it's quite interesting to contrast the 2 views. The third area was this idea of predestination. Augustine combated what's known as the Pelagian heresy, which is a belief in free will to enable you not to sin, that every man had this, whereas Augustine believed it was only through divine grace that we could get out of predicament. Now, I don't really want to delve into predestination too much here, because I think it's better when we come on to talk about the Calvinists later on. But I just want to flag it up as a point. The fourth area is this idea of creation. Now, Augustine was an advocate of creation out of nothing, or to use the posh Latin phrase, creation ex nihilo, whereas the ancient Greeks believed that all creation had to come from something, so as many of the early Greek myths were about imposing order on chaos. Now, I mean, modern science doesn't particularly push us down either of these routes. It suggests that mass can neither be created nor destroyed, but it's possible that if we do live in a universe in which the positive and negative energies cancel, that could come into being out of nothing. I'm not going to pretend to understand the maths behind this, because my maths isn't particularly great. But it goes to show this is an area of controversy that goes on to this day. The fifth area that Augustine looked into was time. Now, this wasn't really dealt with so much by later Christian philosophers, but it was a point of interest much later on. And Augustine was interested in time because of this idea of God being omnipotent, which meant that he had to be outside of time. Now, Augustine's view was that God was this point outside of time, and all that time was sort of a movement away, similar to Plato. There was this perfect form of eternity, and time was simply a movement away from this perfect form of eternity. Well, in this case, the form of eternity was in God, and it was the movement of man away from God that led to the passage of time. Now, in modern terms, we know that space and time are one thing, thanks to Einstein, and that if you go fast enough, like close to near the speed of light, time slows. And we can represent this combination of space and time by 4 coordinates. We can have the 3 dimensions of space, your typical height, width and depth, and a point of time. Now, Augustine believed that only the present existed, but we can believe that, we understand that, according to this coordinate system, that points in the past do technically exist under such a coordinate system, although whether we can actually visit them is very much open to doubt. And the final area I want to talk about is an area which is still contentious today. It's not really a purely philosophical area in terms of, being or time, kind of ontological questions. It's more of an ethical question, and this is about sexuality and women. Now, Augustine, as we discussed in the first part, towards the end of his life, didn't have any sexual relations with women, and in this, his view sort of is of women as not being, equal to men. He was very similar to many of his contemporaries, and his predecessors, like Aristotle, who viewed women as second-class citizens. He viewed them as more mischievous and more impulsive, and this reflected the patriarchal society of Greece and Rome, which is very different to our society today. So I don't really think it's fair to blame Augustine for the subjugation of women during much of the period after the fall of Rome. He was just sort of carrying on this, tradition which, in our modern eyes looks unacceptable, but back then it's just the way things were. I mean, one of the differences was, however, was that in the pagan world, women could be teachers. So you had Hypatia, who was the head of the Platonist school, who was a woman, but after the Christians came to authority, this idea was pretty much crushed. Now, where the views did diverge was on homosexuality. In the ancient world, homosexuality was very permissible. You had Alcibiades, the reputedly dashing Greek general, trying it on with Socrates in Plato's almost novel called the Symposium. But then compare that to, say, Emperor Theodosius, who lived during the life of Augustine, who burned homosexuals at the stake, and you get an idea that things had changed very much. So I think, we can see that Augustine was responsible to some extent for increasing hardlining of Roman views and the lack of tolerance, but it's unfair to pin all the blame solely on his shoulders. Now, in 410 AD, 15 years after Augustine became Bishop of Hippo, Rome itself was sacked by the Goths, and this is kind of where he found the time to write down all these thoughts on fairly abstract things. After the city of Man had fallen, Augustine, much like Plotinus before him during the crisis of the 3rd century, retreated into the citadel of the mind. It's sad to note that when he died in 430, he was the last man in his town of Hippo in Africa to possess books, and with the passing of Augustine, Western Europe began its fall into darkness.